Well, let's go. Let's cut straight to the chase. My first guest, we mustn't waste any time with. I know he had a bit of a night out with his family, but he's hauled himself out of bed to talk radio. It's Piers Morgan. Hello, Piers. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well, mate. How are you?
Yeah, nice night last night.
It was. I was out with my couple of my sons, one of whom has a very similar view of the pandemic to you, so it was a lively exchange of views.
Yes, I'm with Spencer. Perhaps we'll talk about that a bit later, because I think that actually, although the coronavirus crisis is very important, whatever you think about it, it's a very, very important issue. I don't think it is as important as the issue you've brought up in your new book, Wake Up, which is about the onset of wokeism and the threat, I think, that wokeism poses to us as a society. The woke warriors are the enemies of free speech, and this is what your book's all about. What inspired you to write this?
Well, I think actually what you just said, there was no doubt before the pandemic started, the world was going completely nuts to the extent on Good Morning Britain, I actually had a button that we would press in the gallery, which would have me in an American accent exclaiming, "The world's gone nuts," and it would be like endless, ridiculous stories from, radical feminists wanting James Bond to be a woman to Google removing the egg from their salad emoji because it offended radical vegans, to Altrincham School for Girls banning the word girls from being used in the school, but keeping the name Altrincham School for Girls. And there were so many examples of this kind of insane woke, illiberal liberalism. And I came at it really from a point of view of, I'm not right-wing and I'm not particularly left-wing. I'm a sort of old-fashioned centre-ground liberal in many ways. And I just couldn't see how anyone who preaches this kind of woke nonsense could categorize themselves as a liberal, because there's something liberal about the cancel culture. In fact, it's the antithesis of liberalism.
How did it happen, Piers? I mean, it seems to have engulfed the nation very, very quickly. Even a year ago, I didn't feel as oppressed by it all as I do now. But now it's all around you. Every single day you see a crazy story. Winston Churchill was a racist. The Admiral Nelson was a disgrace to the nation. Just these patent absurdities that are pounded at us, and people end up taking them seriously, and it becomes a serious issue. How did this happen in Great Britain?
Well, I think the answer is probably twofold. One, it had been a growing issue in America, and when America sneezes, we all tend to get a cold. And then certainly the no platforming culture at universities began in America and has now sadly come here, where students just refuse to tolerate any speaker that doesn't fit the woke worldview, which is a worldview that's a very narrow worldview shared by a very small number of people. But those people tend to be extremely aggressive and very relentless and very loud and unpleasant on social media, and in particular Twitter. And what it's done, it's created these extraordinarily intense echo chambers where they only follow people who agree with them, and they recoil against anyone that disagrees. Now, people on the right do the same thing. This is not really a book aimed at the right. They have as many people that do stupid stuff as well. This is actually aimed directly at people who claim to be liberal, because there, to me, is an appalling hypocrisy. And I'll give an example recently when we had Donald Trump saying he had coronavirus, and we knew the same thing happened when Boris Johnson did. The first reaction of these caring, sharing, liberal, tolerant, freedom-loving people was to wish both men dead. And they were proud to do it on social media. And many of them had blue ticks. And in Trump's case, one had been a senior member of the Obama administration at the Obama White House. And you're like, how can you call yourselves liberals, you people? But I think what was going on, I think we had, oddly and ironically, we hadn't really had a major global crisis to deal with. And I think that had led a younger generation into a mindset where they were trying to find offence in everything, where they were trying to, have their moment in the sun on Twitter and stir up all sorts of incendiary cancel culture kind of bombshells to get rid of people, because they hadn't really had anything to really test them. Then came the pandemic back in March, April, killing obviously a lot of people and a lot of fear and the lockdown and so on. And for a while, wokery got paused. And
Yes.
I really thought as one of the few benefits I thought might come out of this horrific situation was that we may actually have got our perspective back. And then came the summer and the killing of George Floyd and the protests. And then rather than being legitimate protests, an appalling killing of an African-American man at the knee of a racist police officer, it very quickly became an excuse for the woke brigade to demand the cancellation of absolutely everything. Whether it was, Fawlty Towers, whether it was Winston Churchill, whether it was, people's hairstyles, Halloween costumes, jokes, comedians, everybody was getting cancelled because the woke brigade seized on that legitimate reason to protest and turned it into an umbrella excuse to go completely nuts.
Yeah, and that's the sinister side of what you're writing about in your book. It's all very well for these hysterical people to shout and scream about their absurd views about people like Churchill, Nelson, etc. But it gets worse than that, because if you stand up to them, or if you break what they see as their sacred code for what you should believe and how you should live, then, as you say, they try to cancel you. So they bombard your employers with tweets and Facebook messages. Fire this person. He's a racist. He's a disgrace. And I'm afraid that corporations and employers, companies, organisations do tend to be rather lily-livered when it comes to the woke brigade, and they often do cancel people.
Yeah, and that's really the problem, is that it's not about people like me that have big platforms. I can look after myself, and I've got good employers with broad shoulders who bat away this kind of thing. But there have been petitions to have me fired signed by up to 100,000 people. There's been more than one, and they've been unsuccessful. People have tried to gag me by complaining in mass numbers to Ofcom, the TV regulator. That's also failed. But they'll try anything to get people that they just don't agree with cancelled and silenced. Now, I have a lot of strong opinions about everything, as do you. We've known each other a long time, and we've had many vigorous debates about all sorts of stuff. But I would never imagine having a sort of vigorous debate with you and then wanting, because you didn't agree with everything I said, to have you fired and have your life ruined. It wouldn't even cross my mind, because I thought I lived in a democracy where actually that's not what you do. But that, our democracy, sadly, is now being dominated more and more by a small section of the country with a very big presence on social media, who are terrifying corporate England and corporate UK generally into getting rid of people for the slightest deviation from the woke worldview. And the classic example recently, we saw the attempt to try and cancel JK Rowling, who was airing perfectly legitimate concerns about where do trans rights start to impinge on women's rights. And I think there are, in things like sport, for example, this is a really important conversation. We've seen with World Rugby now saying that they don't want transgender women to compete against women born to female biological bodies. Well, that should be completely obvious. Obviously, if you're born to a male biological body, predominantly you're going to be a lot taller, more powerful and stronger than women who are born to female biological bodies. It doesn't make you transphobic to think that that is a concern that needs to be debated. But no, the answer to JK Rowling raising issues like this was to have a hashtag RIP JK Rowling. They wanted her dead. Now, obviously, she's not going to be cancelled because she's a billionaire. But what did happen was other people supported her, and there were authors who were cancelled by their publishing houses because they dared to retweet support for JK Rowling. And I'm watching all this. What is this?
Yes.
When did our country?
By the way, Piers,
where you can't talk about legitimate areas of concern which have real impact on society without if you don't subscribe to a particular way of thinking and acting and behaving and speaking, then you're going to have your life ruined.
Yeah, and it got so absurd, the JK Rowling argument, that at one point, one of the major Harry Potter fan clubs, and a massive organisation all around the world, disassociated itself from JK Rowling.
I mean, ridiculous.
the author of Harry Potter.
Yeah, Daniel Radcliffe, who owes his entire career to J.K. Rowling because he starred in the Harry Potter films, obviously, he then rants away about her as if she is some kind of hideous, vile transphobe, which she's not, from anything I've seen. She's just raised legitimate concerns about where trans rights may impinge on women's rights, and what do we do about that? How do we give fairness and equality to everyone who transitions or is a transgender person without damaging women's rights. And that is a legitimate thing to be debating. And it should be done with respect and honesty, but also an openness about the debate itself.
What's the game plan? What's the end game for these people? I mean, I think a lot of them are just hangers-on who just jump on the bandwagon. But some of them, I think, my theory would be they're real extremists and they sort of want to overturn and topple capitalism and society as we know it, to absolutely cause chaos and destruction to the status quo, if you see what I mean.
Well, no question. And I think I would add the word radical before all of this. So I talk in the book about radical feminists and how dangerous they are to the cause of feminism, which I personally sign up to by the original definition of what feminism is, which is just a seeking of fairness and equality for women on the same level as men. I think most men I know would agree with that. But we don't agree with the radical fringe element of feminism that's want to hate men, cancel men, portray everything that's masculine as somehow evil. And then you take, the vegan vegetarian debate. I've got no problem. People want to eat plants all day. That's their problem. I've got no problem with that at all. However, if they want to march into my steakhouse, as some of these radical vegans do, playing loud music of cows being slaughtered and chanting, "You are evil," then I'm going to order another T-bone and get them out of there. And I just think it's not good enough for them to practice a certain way of life themselves. They are insisting that we all practice exactly the same way of life as them on pain of cancellation. And it's that part of it which I find so unacceptable. You ask where is it going to go? Well, they never win power, these people. So, you can only really affect proper change if you win power. There's never going to be a woke prime minister of this country or a woke president of the United States, because the mass populace of these countries is never going to tolerate it. So I think there's a sort of fail-safe there in terms of the real effect they can have. But what I really want to see is companies standing up to this woke culture and refusing to bow to the mob and standing by their employees' right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And obviously, if you're an outrageous, horrible racist, then that's different. But that's not what we're talking about here. This is about people being fired because they may, retweet something Nigel Farage has said about, immigration. You may or may not agree with him, but he's entitled to his opinions, and you should be entitled to agree with them if you want to.
It's interesting that you cite the vegans who invaded. I think they were at the steakhouse in Brighton, wasn't it? And what I'm getting at is, what can we do about these people? What can we do to combat their absurdity and their insanity? As you say, corporations should stand up to them. That would help. Organizations stand up to them. That would help. But in that incident in the restaurant that you write about amusingly in your book, they invade the restaurant, start playing cow music and all this, and a bunch of guys enjoying a steak all stood up and started chanting, "Stand up if you love red meat." and the vegans were completely nonplussed by this, perplexed by this show of defiance, and barely knew what to do and just screamed louder. So I think, as an allegory, we should try as a society to do the same thing, to shout as loud as they do, because otherwise I don't see how we're going to silence them.
Well, I think that's right. I think the problem with it all is that they pretend they speak for everybody, and of course they don't. So only 20% of people in the world are on Twitter, of which a 10% minority of those make 80% of the noise and post 80% of the tweets, and they tend to skew quite woke. That means on Twitter there's a constant sense that they're speaking for everybody. And then, of course, they wake up the morning after the Brexit referendum, or they wake up after the last US election, or they wake up after the last UK election, and they can't believe what's happened, because their echo chamber assured them we were going to stay in the European Union, Jeremy Corbyn was going to be Prime Minister, and Hillary Clinton was going to be President. And they all, every single time, caught a massive cold when actually the people who are not screaming all day long on Twitter actually went and voted a completely different way. And I think part of the rise of populism and populist leaders like Trump and Boris Johnson and others, it's a kickback against woke culture, because neither of those two, I've got my serious concerns about their leadership this year with the pandemic, but neither of them could ever be accused of bowing to the woke mob. And, I'm glad to see that at least on some of these issues, like when Rule Britannia was going to be axed from the proms, it may seem a small thing, but it's a deliberate act by somebody to basically attack something that's made this country great. And I think that annoyed everybody, rather like having to board up Winston Churchill's statue in Parliament Square in case it's attacked and defaced. And I think that we need to see more people standing up who have positions of power and responsibility and employ a lot of people to defend their employees' right, as I say, to free speech.
Absolutely. So your book, I'm just holding it up to the camera, Wake Up, it's called, by Piers Morgan. And apart from the fact it makes some very, very important points that I think are fundamental to the future health of this nation, it's a damned entertaining read. It's done in a sort of diary style. So I highly recommend it to anyone. Whether or not you agree with me and Piers about the threat of wokeism, it's well worth reading. Just before you go, Piers, I know that you went to war last night with your son Spencer about the coronavirus crisis. I'm on Spencer's side. Why is it? Listen, this is my point. Coronavirus, the COVID-19, is not a serious danger to the vast majority of people in this country. It is only affecting a massive minority, and it will never affect the majority. Most people will never even encounter it. Why do you think it's so important that we should close down the country, wreck the economy, ruin lives, crash businesses?
Well, let me give you well, first of all, I don't think it's important that we ruin the economy and crash lives and all the rest of it. I'm not somebody who thinks lockdowns are good. They are obviously not a good thing to be doing. They're going to have a devastating effect on the economy, on jobs, and as we know, in other residual areas of public health with people who can't get treatment for cancer, heart disease, and so on. But I do believe a government's job is to protect people's jobs and their lives in a pandemic of this nature, and that's where this government so far singularly failed to do it. There are lots of arguments here. It basically comes down to one of three things, I think. We don't have a testing system that works. So you can't control this at the moment with the testing system that we have because it's not good enough. Other countries can. In China last week, 9 million residents of one city got tested in 5 days after they had 8 cases break out. They can do that because they have a sophisticated testing system. Germany's had a much better record in the pandemic, far fewer deaths, like a sixth of Britain's, because they got a sophisticated testing system. We don't have that. So what are our options now? As the second wave comes, indisputably, numbers surging, hospitalizations going up, deaths going up, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So what do we do to protect people whilst also not crashing the economy and losing their lives? You have several options. One is the regional lockdown idea, where if you have a particular blow up in somewhere like Liverpool right now, which is the second worst cases and hospitalizations in Europe, you could lock down Liverpool for a period of time until you calm things down. Or do you then say the Northwest, or do you then say the whole country? If you're down in Cornwall and you've got hardly any cases, you're thinking, well, why do we have to get locked down? And I think it's a perfectly legitimate concern. So I'm not somebody screaming for lockdowns in the way that I was back in March, April, when we knew nothing about this.
Well, I agree with the lockdown then because we didn't know what we were dealing with. Now,
right.
I absolutely don't agree with it.
Well, what I don't agree with you about is the threat level of COVID-19. It's completely correct that for most people, it's not going to be seriously damaging. But for a sector of the community, and by the way, it's a lot of people who are in the vulnerable category. If you think about it, what we now know about the virus is it targets the elderly. So there's millions of people who would be in that category. It targets anyone with a sort of underlying health condition. Add a few more million. We know it targets a lot more people in the BAME community than it does in the white community. So think about another few million on top of that. Before you get to the end of the line of vulnerable people who need to be shielded, which is, I think, what your argument's been, you could be talking 20 million people. So actually, you are locking down half the country, even if all you're doing is shielding those who are more vulnerable to the virus. And if you get this thing badly, it is a devastating virus. This idea that the whole world has basically shut down for months and months and months now because it's a form of the flu is, I'm afraid, complete nonsense.
It's not a form of the flu. But, I have had it. I had it for about 3 weeks. It wasn't very nice. It wasn't that bad. But I do accept that for some people, it's not only terrible, but it's also can be lethal. It just worries me that this is the first time this has ever happened. The world has never got together to battle a virus in a coordinated system whereby we are shutting down our economies, we're locking people in houses. We've never done this before. Humanity has never done this before. And if we're going to do it every single time, we are all going to hell in a handcart. I just think we should not be overreacting like we are now. And I feel like I'm trapped in a vortex of madness.
Well, I tell you what I feel on this. I've said yesterday that everyone's turned into an amateur epidemiologist, and in fact, even the epidemiologists don't agree with each other. So and again, fueled by social media, people are getting into two tribes again. Pro-lockdown, anti-lockdown, and if you're not in the right tribe, the other side will want everybody to die, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think any of that is helpful. I think the certainty that people are talking about this virus with is inconsistent with the fact that so many scientists disagree. And I think we have to have a more considered debate about it. I'd like the whole world to have a more global debate about this and have a more concerted effort. Because what we do know is we've now got some drugs that have emerged in the last few months which are definitely stopping as many people dying. I don't agree that the virus is losing any strength. There's no evidence for that. But we are definitely getting better treatment, and it is stopping as many people dying as were dying at the rate before. That is a good thing. I don't think we can rely on a vaccine. So,
I agree with that.
In sympathy to your point, I don't think we can continue to just lock everything down repeatedly if there's no sign of a vaccine and no sign of an end game to this. So at some point, we do have to live with this virus in some way. The question is, how do you do that without, as I say, 20 million or more vulnerable people? In other words, those who have more chance of getting this badly and potentially fatally because of their condition or because of their ethnicity. What do we do to protect them as you go forward? And it is an incredibly difficult question.
Yes, it is. Piers, thank you so much for your time. The one thing that you and I do agree on, we have our serious doubts about the way this government and Boris is handling the crisis. And the last thing I would say to you is listen to your son, Spencer. He's a very wise young man. Thanks, mate. Good luck with the book.
Thanks, Kevin. All the best.
Cheers, Piers.